6 US Navy planes vanished here in a single afternoon, and the men flying them were never seen again. The mission was supposed to be routine, a simple training flight off the coast of Florida. Instead, it turned into one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time, where 14 well-trained soldiers vanished without a trace. It was December 5th, 1945, a clear, cool day in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The war was over, but the Navy stayed busy. Pilots trained daily, preparing for the next generation of missions, in a world that suddenly seemed a lot more fragile after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That afternoon, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers sat lined up on the runway at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. These weren't glamorous fighters. They were heavy, rugged planes built for endurance, the kind that had hunted Japanese ships in the Pacific. To the men climbing aboard, this mission was supposed to be routine. A practice flight, nothing more. The assignment was called Navigation Problem Number 1. The plan was simple enough. Fly east over the Atlantic, practice a series of bombing runs over a small stretch of open water, then turn north for a set distance, and finally swing back west toward base. A neat triangular route, one they had flown countless times before. The man in charge that day was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, an experienced pilot who had logged hundreds of hours in the air. The 4 other pilots were younger, students still sharpening their skills. At 2:10 p.m, they lifted off one by one, engines roaring, wings cutting into the Florida sky. Together they formed a tight squadron, flying east over the endless blue Atlantic. The planes called the Avengers flew smoothly at first. The Avengers weren't fast compared to fighters, but they were steady and tough. Inside the cockpits, the student pilots tracked their gauges, marked coordinates, and listened for Taylor's voice over the radio. Everything was by the book. When they reached their practice area, the pilots began mock bombing runs. This was a standard exercise. Fly low, simulate an attack, then climb back out. Nothing unusual. After completing the practice phase, Taylor led the squadron north. The sun was beginning its slow descent, the golden light scattering across the waves. But somewhere along that northward leg, things started to go wrong. At 3:40 p.m, the first troubling transmission came through. One of the student pilots reported that his compass wasn't working properly. Shortly after, Taylor's voice cut in. "Both my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm overland, but it's broken. I'm not sure where I am." This was alarming. A pilot's compass was his lifeline. Without it, the endless sky and sea became a blur of sameness. In those waters, there was little to orient by, just islands and waves stretching in every direction. The students grew uneasy. Some suggested they fly west, back toward the mainland, but Taylor hesitated. He insisted they were over the Florida Keys, which would mean turning northeast to return. Others argued they were actually over the Bahamas, in which case flying west was the right move. The confusion deepened. And here is where it got weirder. Radio operators on the ground listened in, but they couldn't find the Avengers on their radar. They tried to triangulate the position, but the transmissions were broken. Sometimes it was clear, sometimes it was fading into static. At one point, Taylor was heard saying, "Everything looks strange, even the ocean. We're not sure of any direction. Even the sea doesn't look as it should." As the hours ticked by, transmissions grew more desperate. At around 6 p.m, one pilot was overheard suggesting they ditch into the sea if fuel ran too low. Taylor gave orders to stay together, to hold formation. His last transmission was faint, almost lost in static. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." Then silence. The Navy waited. They expected a distress call, or at least a flicker of wreckage picked up on radar. Instead, nothing came. No signal. No location. The 5 bombers had disappeared into the night. 14 men were gone. Search crews scrambled into action immediately. Other planes were sent into the skies, scanning the waters where Flight 19 was last believed to be. Ships were dispatched to comb the seas. They looked for oil slicks, life rafts, and even floating debris. Hours passed. Still nothing. Not a single trace of the Avengers, or the men inside them, was ever found. The first hours after Flight 19 vanished were chaotic. Radios went quiet, the compass readings had made no sense, and then nothing. The US Navy had men missing, and in military culture, that's an emergency that demands immediate action. The call went out fast, scrambling rescue crews. That same evening, a PBM Mariner seaplane was ordered into the skies. The Mariner was a beast of an aircraft, big, bulky, and built to carry heavy loads across long stretches of ocean. Crews called it the flying gas tank because of its massive fuel capacity. On board were 13 experienced men, trained to search for lost aircraft and survivors. Their mission was to find any trace of the Avengers before darkness swallowed the sea. The Mariner roared off the runway, heavy with fuel, supplies, and determination. The Mariner headed toward the last known position of Flight 19, scanning the endless stretch of Atlantic. Meanwhile, back on land, naval commanders felt a flicker of relief that finally something was being done. The disappearance of 5 aircraft was bad enough, but the hope was that maybe this massive seaplane would spot rafts, oil slicks, or even faint distress flares. If only they knew that it was about to get way worse, because less than an hour after takeoff, the Mariner went silent. No distress call, no static-filled message, just gone. The first hint came from the SS Gainesmills, a tanker ship cutting through the waters not far from the search zone. The crew looked up and saw a flash, followed by a ball of fire in the night sky. Some swore it was an explosion, bright enough to be unmistakable. The men on board stared at the burning light until it sputtered and vanished into the black Atlantic horizon. When word reached Naval Command, hearts sank. The only plane sent to search for Flight 19 had disappeared as well, and not in some vague, drawn-out mystery like the Avengers. This time, there were witnesses. There was fire in the sky. The implication was immediate. The Mariner had exploded mid-air. To understand why the naval officers knew instinctively that the Mariner exploded without investigation, you've got to know a little about the PBM Mariner's reputation. Crews didn't exactly trust the aircraft. Those giant fuel tanks that made it perfect for long missions also made it prone to disaster. One spark, one technical glitch, and the whole plane could turn into a fireball. It had happened before. Sailors half-jokingly and half-seriously called it the flying gas can. So when reports came in of the explosion, the Navy chalked it up to a tragic, but not unprecedented, accident. The official explanation leaned hard on the Mariner's volatile design. But for the men on the Gainesmills who'd watched it, the timing was too eerie. A search plane disappearing on the very night it was supposed to rescue 5 other vanished planes. It felt like something bigger, something almost scripted by the ocean itself. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The Navy wasn't dealing with one lost flight anymore. It was now 6. 5 Avengers gone without a trace, and the Mariner seaplane, with its 13 crew, apparently swallowed whole after a brief fireball in the sky. In just a matter of hours, 27 men had vanished. What followed would become the largest air-sea rescue mission in American history up to that time. The scale was enormous. More than 300 boats and ships, backed by dozens of aircraft, were dispatched across the Atlantic waters east of Florida. Search crews stretched themselves over 300,000 square miles of ocean, an area bigger than the entire state of Texas. In the military's eyes, no expense was too great. If there was even a chance of survivors drifting on rafts or clinging to wreckage, they would find them. For the first few days, the atmosphere was filled with urgency and hope. Pilots crisscrossed the skies in tight search patterns. Naval destroyers cut through the seas, sweeping left and right in long arcs. From above, the ocean looked endless, but the crews kept believing maybe the Avengers had ditched on the water and their men were floating in life vests. Maybe the Mariner that vanished had made an emergency landing. Maybe there was still time, but days turned into a cruel blur of nothing. What baffled the searchers most was the complete silence of the sea. In almost every aviation disaster of that era, something always remained. A wing, a fuel tank, an oil slick, a rubber raft, something. Aircraft were fragile by nature. When they hit water at high speed, they shattered, scattering debris over miles. Even if a crash burned, metal parts floated. If a plane ditched smoothly, life rafts, jackets and flares bobbed to the surface. But here, nothing. Not one life jacket. Not one scrap of fuselage. Not one oil stain smeared across the blue Atlantic. The ocean gave no answers. It was as if the planes just vanished. Investigators scratched their heads. They knew how unlikely this was. The Avengers were big machines, each over 40 feet long, with engines, landing gear, and radios that wouldn't just vanish. The Mariner seaplane was even bigger, nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank, because it carried so much fuel. And yet, the sea was empty, calm and clean, mocking their efforts. The sailors and pilots on the search runs began to whisper what no one wanted to say out loud. This wasn't a normal disappearance. Something was wrong here. Something supernatural had happened. Back on land, the families of the missing men endured their own torment. Wives, mothers, fathers, and children gathered around radios and newspapers, desperate for updates. The first reports were confusing. Some suggested the planes might have landed on islands in the Bahamas. Others hinted at survivors spotted drifting in rafts. Rumours spread like wildfire. Maybe the pilots had been captured by foreign powers. Maybe they were stranded on some uncharted sandbar. Maybe they were alive, waiting for rescue. Families clung to each rumour, no matter how unlikely, because the alternative was unbearable. The Navy tried to calm the speculation, but the silence of the sea only fueled hope and fear in equal measure. Every day without wreckage was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it meant there was still no proof of death. A curse because it meant there was no closure. As the days dragged on, the Navy's optimism began to drain. The search kept expanding, but the results never changed. Empty skies, empty seas, empty hands. After more than a week of relentless effort, the Navy admitted the obvious. No survivors were going to be found. For the Navy, this wasn't just a human tragedy. It was a public relations nightmare. How do you explain to the American people that not one, but two separate aircraft formations disappeared in the same mission, and in the same patch of ocean already whispered about as cursed? The official reports were careful. They pointed to human error for the Avengers and mechanical failure for the Mariner. But outside those offices, whispers spread. The Bermuda Triangle had taken another set of lives. Exactly where both planes disappeared was right over the Bermuda Triangle. The disappearance of the rescue plane turned what was already a strange event into a legend. Flight 19 by itself might have been remembered as a tragic training mishap. But the Mariner's fate doubled the mystery, deepened the questions, and cemented the story into folklore. People love coincidences, but they fear them too. And this was too big a coincidence to ignore. Pilots, mechanics, and officers all asked the same thing. What's out there? Even if you didn't believe in curses or mysterious forces, the facts were chilling. 2 flights, 2 disappearances, 1 night. With the Mariner gone, the story of Flight 19 took on a new life. It was an unsolved mystery that felt too bizarre to be real. Journalists, writers, and later television producers would all seize on this chapter. The idea of a rescue plane disappearing while looking for another missing flight gave the story its hook. It's the kind of detail you can't make up, the kind that makes people lean closer and whisper, "Something's not right here." The case shifted from rescue to investigation. The Navy compiled reports, interviewed officers, and tried to piece together what happened. At first, the official statement was blunt. The disappearance had no clear cause. The report read simply, "Cause unknown." But that conclusion didn't sit well with the higher-ups. The Navy couldn't just admit that 5 planes and a massive rescue seaplane had gone missing under its watch without explanation. So the language changed. Quietly, the report was altered. Instead of shrugging, the blame began to point toward one man, flight leader Charles Taylor. Taylor had been an experienced pilot, but the Navy decided he'd become disoriented. They claimed he mistook the Florida Keys for the Bahamas, panicked, and led his men farther out to sea. By the time the sun went down, their fuel ran out, and they ditched in the ocean. According to this version, the men likely died quickly in the cold water, their wreckage sinking before it could be spotted. But even as the report placed responsibility on Taylor, many within the Navy weren't convinced. Other pilots who trained with him said Taylor wasn't the type to lose his bearings so badly. Plus, if he was wrong, how did every other pilot in the squadron follow him without a single radio challenge? And even if they all went down at sea, how could 6 aircraft spread across a search zone so vast leave not a trace? The official story felt too neat, too convenient, like a patch placed over a hole no one knew how to fill. By the time the Navy officially called off the search, the tally was staggering. 5 Avengers, 1 Mariner, 27 men, and not a single answer. And for many that was just the beginning, because the moment the Navy said case closed, the public said the opposite. And this time they looked into the Bermuda Triangle for answers. By the 1950s, aviation was exploding. Commercial flights were carrying passengers across oceans, and the public was fascinated with the idea of both the dangers and wonders of the skies. Newspapers, magazines, and pulp writers fed that fascination. And that's where the seeds of the Bermuda Triangle first took root. In September 1950, a reporter named Edward Van Winkle Jones published an article in the Miami Herald. It was short, less than a page, but it carried a headline that caught attention. Ships and planes were vanishing in a region bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Jones listed cases that seemed to defy explanation most prominently. Flight 19. He described the training mission as if it had vanished without a trace, which was true, since no wreckage was ever recovered. But Jones didn't stop there. He pointed to other disappearances in the area. The most notable was the USS Cyclops, a massive Navy fuel ship, which vanished in 1918, along with its crew of over 300 men. No SOS, no wreckage, no bodies. The Navy had no answer then, and Jones resurrected the mystery 30 years later. By placing Flight 19 alongside Cyclops, Jones created the impression of a pattern. Readers weren't just seeing one tragedy anymore, they were being invited to see a chain of them. It wasn't yet called the Bermuda Triangle, but the idea was now seeded in the public's imagination that the waters off Florida were dangerous, mysterious, and maybe even cursed. 5 years later, in 1955, the magazine Fate, known for publishing paranormal and unexplained stories, carried an article by George X. Sand. George gathered stories of missing planes and ships in the Western Atlantic and wrote them with a flair for suspense. Again, Flight 19 was front and centre. He retold the radio transcripts where the pilots said their compasses didn't work and they couldn't see land. He added in more maritime vanishings, like the disappearance of the British ship Star Tiger in 1948 and the Star Ariel in 1949. Both were commercial airliners flying between Bermuda and the Caribbean, and both vanished without leaving wreckage. For readers, it felt uncanny, and for Flight 19, it meant its story was no longer isolated. It had become part of an unfolding zone of disappearances. Then came Vincent Gaddis. A writer fascinated with the unexplained, Gaddis published a long article in the February 1964 issue of Argosy, a men's adventure magazine. His piece had a title that would stick forever: The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. For the first time, someone drew actual lines on a map, Miami to Bermuda to Puerto Rico, and declared that within this triangular region, ships and planes had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Gaddis listed dozens of incidents just like his predecessors. He didn't claim supernatural forces outright, but he emphasised the strangeness too. No wreckage, no survivors, no radio signals, nothing. The phrase Bermuda Triangle entered the English language here. What Jones hinted at and what George dramatised, Gaddis solidified into a named, mapped mystery. Gaddis called Flight 19 the cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend. And he was right. Without it, the area might have been known for shipwrecks, but nothing more unusual than any other stretch of ocean. With Flight 19, the legend gained a face, a voice, and a defining story. The Navy's Cause Unknown report had been turned into a doorway for mystery. The phrase Devil's Triangle began appearing alongside this explanation. It suggested that natural forces, magnetic currents invisible to the human eye, were guiding travellers to their doom. Stories about compasses spinning wildly on ship decks or pilots reporting that their instruments suddenly became useless circulated widely. Flight 19, the squadron of Navy bombers, lost in December 1945, was often cited as the perfect example. Radio transcripts from the pilots included complaints about not knowing which way was west, even though the sun should have been their guide. For believers in magnetic anomalies, that confusion sounded like proof. Books like Vincent Gaddis's Invisible Horizons, 1965, leaned heavily on this theory. Gaddis tied stories of magnetic disturbances to a long chain of disappearances, making it sound as though an invisible hand was reaching out from the sea, to drag compasses, ships and planes into oblivion. But that's just one theory. Wait till you hear the second one. If magnetic anomalies gave the Bermuda Triangle a scientific edge, the Atlantis theory gave it a mythological heart. The link between the two was not obvious at first. Atlantis was a story told by the Greek philosopher Plato thousands of years ago, describing a lost island civilization that sank into the sea. For centuries, people debated whether it was a metaphor or a real place. Then, in the 20th century, American psychic Edgar Cayce gave Atlantis a new life. Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, claimed in the 1930s and 1940s that Atlantis had been a highly advanced society with technology beyond our own. According to his visions, remnants of this civilization were buried in the waters near the Bahamas, right on the edge of what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle. He spoke of crystal energy machines that once powered Atlantis and suggested that these devices might still be active deep underwater. Once the Bermuda Triangle legend began to spread, Cayce's followers found an obvious connection. If ships and planes were vanishing, maybe they were being destroyed or even transported by ancient Atlantean energy fields. Then shortly, books began to describe glowing pyramids beneath the sea, strange sonar echoes bouncing off submerged structures, and divers who supposedly stumbled across giant stone blocks on the ocean floor near Bimini. The Bimini Road, which turned out to be a natural rock formation discovered in 1968, was immediately claimed as proof of Cayce's predictions, even though geologists explained it as naturally eroded limestone. And Kirintinyi. In the Bermuda Triangle narrative, it became an Atlantean highway leading straight into the unknown. But as crazy as this theory was, the next one made this theory sound normal. The idea was simple. If aliens were visiting Earth, then the Triangle could be one of their bases. The region's isolation, its reputation for strange lights, and the sheer number of disappearances made it the perfect candidate. People began to suggest that when ships and planes went missing, they weren't crashing at all, they were being taken. Flight 19 again became the cornerstone of this claim. Later books went even further, suggesting that alien spacecraft had pulled entire ships from the water. Charles Berlitz's bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle, 1974, made this theory mainstream, filling pages with dramatic retellings of disappearances framed as extraterrestrial kidnappings. Eyewitness stories also began to circulate. Sailors reported strange lights hovering over the ocean, pilots spoke of glowing objects streaking across the sky, and some even claimed to have lost time as if hours had passed in a blink. One of the most famous accounts came from pilot Bruce Jernan, who in the 1970s said he encountered an electronic fog while flying over the Bahamas. According to his story, his plane was surrounded by a tunnel-like cloud, and when he emerged from such a cloud, he had travelled far more quickly than should have been possible. To believers, this sounded like a wormhole, an accidental shortcut through time and space. I covered his story, and to be frank, his case was very peculiar. I honestly think he was onto something, because he had witnesses in the form of his father and a work colleague, and the radio transmission tower that was guiding him. So if he was lying, someone would have called him out on his lie by now. His story is one of the strong points that something serious is going on with the Bermuda Triangle. I'll leave a link in the description below. Writers jumped on stories like Jernan's to argue that Flight 19 might not have crashed at all. Instead, they suggested the squadron had flown through a dimensional doorway, vanishing not into the sea but into another world or another era, and being lost to ours forever. If there's one thing every mystery attracts, it's skeptics. For decades, the Bermuda Triangle has been painted as this haunted stretch of sea, where ships and planes vanish without a trace. But skeptics argue that the real story is far less supernatural, and maybe even more frustrating. Because if they're right, the legend isn't based on unexplainable forces at all, but on sloppy reporting, human mistakes, and oceans doing what oceans have always done. Back in the mid-1970s, librarian and pilot Larry Kusher got tired of reading the same overblown claims about the Triangle. The books that came out in the late 1960s and early 1970s, most famously Charles Berlitz's The Bermuda Triangle, were runaway bestsellers. They spoke of magnetic fields, UFO abductions, and ancient curses with such authority that the public ate it up. But Kusha, who had a knack for research, decided to go through the records himself. What he found shocked him, not because the disappearances were mysterious, but because so many of them weren't even real. Kusha combed through Coast Guard reports, weather logs, accident files, and eyewitness accounts. He noticed a pattern. Authors were cherry-picking details, exaggerating the unknown, or outright leaving out explanations that were already on record. In his book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved, published in 1975, Kusha bluntly argued that the mystery wasn't the ocean, it was the writers. He pointed out that many disappearances happened during violent storms. Others didn't happen inside the so-called triangle at all, but were relocated there in retellings. Some ships that were supposedly lost forever had in fact sent distress calls, had their wreckage found, or had clear reasons for sinking. Kusha even showed that compasses didn't go crazy in ways that hadn't already been explained in navigation manuals. One of the most famous claims tied to the Bermuda Triangle is that compasses stop working, spinning aimlessly as if pulled by some invisible force. But here's the thing. Pilots and sailors already knew compasses could act up in certain areas. It wasn't news. In fact, it was written down in the very manuals they carried. Compasses don't point to true north. They point to magnetic north, which isn't in the same place. Depending on where you are in the world, the difference, called magnetic variation, can throw off navigation by several degrees. For most sailors and pilots, this was just part of the job. In the Florida coast region, the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, variation was especially tricky because it shifts rapidly depending on where you are. Flight manuals in the 1940s and 1950s included specific warnings about compass quirks in this area. So when Flight 19 vanished in 1945, the reports that Lieutenant Charles Taylor's compass seemed unreliable weren't surprising at all. It wasn't evidence of a paranormal force, it was something any navigator expected to encounter. The real mystery wasn't that the compass might have been off. It was why Taylor ignored his trainee pilots who thought they were flying west when he insisted they were somewhere else entirely. Then there's the other big question. If so many ships and planes disappeared here, where's the wreckage? Shouldn't we find more debris? Skeptics argue that this is exactly what we should expect from this patch of ocean. The Bermuda Triangle lies in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, and it's also home to strong currents, shifting sands and violent storms. When something goes down, the sea doesn't politely leave pieces behind. Instead, wreckage gets scattered across hundreds of miles and carried into the open Atlantic. The Gulf Stream in particular is notorious for this. It's a warm, fast-moving current that flows out of the Gulf of Mexico and sweeps up the eastern coast of the US. Any small piece of debris can be whisked away in hours. Combine that with the fact that some parts of the ocean floor here are over 19,000 feet deep, and it's easy to see why wrecks vanish. Skeptics point out that in other oceans, the same thing happens all the time. Planes and ships have gone missing in the Pacific, Indian and Arctic oceans, with no supernatural explanations required. The difference is that no one gave those regions a catchy name like the Devil's Triangle. Still, for all of Kusha's meticulous research, all of the compass explanations, and all of the science behind ocean currents, there's something that lingers, a stubborn sense of unease. Because if it's just storms, bad navigation and strong currents, why does it feel like this one area produces so many disappearances? That's the whole skeptic's struggle to close. Records do show clusters of accidents in the triangle, especially around the mid-20th century. Sure, skeptics argue that it's because the region is so heavily travelled by both ships and planes, which increases the odds of accidents. But believers counter that other heavily travelled regions don't seem to have the same reputation for vanishing acts. Which brings us to one thing: human error. The first and most obvious explanation came from within the Navy itself. Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, the flight leader, was an experienced pilot, but reports show he had gotten lost before. And on that December afternoon, something about the navigation just didn't add up. The idea is that Taylor mistook the chain of islands he was flying over. Instead of realizing he was near the Bahamas, he convinced himself that the group was further north, near the Florida Keys. If that was the case, every correction he made would have been in the wrong direction, pulling the squadron further and further away from home. By the time they realised what was happening, it may have been too late. If navigation mistakes led them out over the open ocean, the next logical problem was fuel. Those Avengers planes had a limited range, and they'd already been in the air much longer than expected. Radio transcripts show that Taylor was growing increasingly unsure of his position, circling around, second-guessing himself, and eating up precious minutes in the process. The Navy's investigation leaned heavily on this idea. They reasoned that the planes eventually ran out of fuel, forcing the pilots to ditch in the water. The Atlantic that day was choppy, and landing a heavy warplane on open seas was no small feat. More likely than not, the planes would have broken up on impact. Within minutes, they'd sink below the surface, leaving little trace. This explanation is simple, almost too simple. Planes out of gas, nowhere to go, and the ocean swallows them whole. And then there was the fate of the rescue plane, the Martin Mariner, often called the flying gas tank. Less than an hour after taking off to search for Flight 19, it too vanished without a trace. At first, this seemed like the final piece of an unsolvable puzzle, but the Navy had a more straightforward explanation. That theory, an airborne explosion, was so widely accepted within the Navy that they didn't even bother linking the Mariner's disappearance to anything supernatural. To them, it was an accident waiting to happen. But when the story leaked out to the press, it got tangled up in the larger mystery. 2 disappearances, in the same area, within hours. People couldn't help but see a connection, even if the official explanation treated them as unrelated tragedies. So, if you ask me what I think happened to Flight 19, I would say it was just an unfortunate accident that happened. Nothing more, nothing less. But that's just my opinion, and that's where you, the viewer, come in. After all the history, all the failed searches, all the theories you've heard, what do you believe? Was Flight 19 a tragedy of human error and the unforgiving sea? Or did those 5 Avengers stumble into something we still can't explain?